Two teenagers versus the monster in the shadows. A fight for survival. Amber Dubois and Chelsea King. What happens when darkness isn't just outside, but inside you? Amber and Chelsea face a monster like no other. One that isn't just lurking in the shadows, but hiding in their deepest fears. But can they conquer it, or will the nightmare swallow them whole? Don't miss the chilling twist that will leave you questioning everything. Stay until the end to find out if they survive, or if the darkness consumes them forever. Amber and Chelsea walked down the quiet street. It was late. The only sound was the distant hum of a car engine. Their footsteps echoed in the stillness. The streetlights flickered above them. It felt like something was watching. Amber glanced over her shoulder. Chelsea didn't notice, too busy texting. Amber's heart began to race. She heard it again, a soft rustle behind them. It wasn't the wind. It was heavier, closer. Amber grabbed Chelsea's arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Chelsea pulled away, annoyed. "Stop being dramatic," she said. But Amber couldn't shake the feeling. The air grew colder. The shadows seemed to grow longer. Suddenly, Chelsea stopped walking. Amber turned. Her breath caught. Chelsea's eyes were wide with fear. "Amber, look." Amber followed her gaze. Across the street, in the alleyway, something moved. Something tall, dark, and unnatural. It was watching them. Its eyes glowed faintly. Amber's stomach twisted. Her legs felt heavy. Chelsea started to back away. "No," Amber said, her voice shaking. "We need to go." They turned and ran, but the sound followed. Heavy, fast footsteps. Closer, closer. They sprinted faster, adrenaline surging. The cold air bit at their skin. But no matter how fast they ran, it was closer. Closer. Amber's chest tightened. A sound, like a growl, echoed in the distance. Her heart pounded in her ears. Chelsea tripped and fell. "Amber, help," she cried out. Amber turned, heart sinking. Chelsea was reaching for her, but she couldn't reach her. Something dark and massive loomed over Chelsea. A long, twisted arm reached down. Amber screamed, but no sound came. She felt frozen, trapped. Then, the thing turned its gaze toward her. Its eyes were deep, endless. The world seemed to blur. She couldn't look away. It was too late. Amber understood the truth now. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. The streets weren't safe anymore. The monster was real, but Amber's breath caught in her throat. She felt it closing in. The world around her twisted. Her mind raced. Chelsea was gone. Only a shadow remained where she had been. The creature's eyes never left Amber. She could hear its breathing, slow and deep. Her heart hammered in her chest. Her legs felt weak, like they might collapse. The air grew thicker, suffocating. Amber tried to move. Her feet felt glued to the ground. The creature stepped forward, closer and closer still. Amber's body shook uncontrollably. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't form. Then it spoke, a voice that wasn't a voice. It was like a whisper in her head. "You can't escape." Amber's knees buckled. She fell to the ground, panic rising. The creature towered over her, its form now clearer in the dim light. Its skin was slick like oil and stretched tight over its bones. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Amber's pulse raced faster. She couldn't breathe. The creature leaned closer, its breath hot against her face. A scream rose in her throat, but it was swallowed by the silence. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the street. The creature flinched, its attention momentarily breaking. Amber scrambled to her feet. She didn't wait to think. She ran. Her legs burned as she pushed herself faster. The monster was still there, but now it was behind her. Amber ran until her lungs felt like they were on fire. Her body screamed for her to stop, but she didn't. She couldn't. She could still hear the creature somewhere behind her. The sound of its steps had returned. She stumbled into the woods. The trees closed in around her. She gasped for air, every breath sharp. Then she heard it again, a whisper, "You're not safe." Her body froze. The voice came from the shadows, from everywhere. Amber turned, but saw nothing. The night felt too quiet now, too empty. Amber's heart pounded in her ears. The voice was still there, lingering in her mind. She turned in every direction, but all she saw were trees, shadows, and darkness. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Then, a soft rustle from behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The trees creaked overhead, their branches swaying in the wind. Her eyes darted around, frantic. The world felt like it was closing in. A cold hand of fear gripped her chest. She had to keep moving, had to get away. But where? The woods felt endless, disorienting. Every path led to another twisted, dark corner. The whispering came again, louder this time, closer. "You can't hide." The words slithered into her mind, making her head spin. Amber stumbled, her feet unsteady. She heard a low growl from the depths of the trees. Her skin prickled with cold dread. The sound was too close, too real. She tried to run again, but her legs felt heavier. Her surroundings blurred as panic surged through her. Then she saw it, a figure in the distance. At first, it was just a silhouette, tall, wide, and impossible to miss. But it wasn't just a shadow. The creature was real, standing among the trees. Its eyes glowed, pale and cold. Amber froze, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It was the same thing, the same monster. But this time, there was something different. It was smiling. A twisted, unnatural grin spread across its face. Its teeth gleamed under the moonlight. Amber's breath caught in her throat. It took a step forward, slowly. Amber didn't know how much longer she could keep running. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But she couldn't stop, not with that thing behind her. The growl rumbled again, louder this time. It was right behind her. She was trapped. Amber's heart raced, and she felt a wave of hopelessness crash over her. She couldn't escape. Not from this. Not from him. And just before the creature reached her, a bright light flashed through the trees. For a moment, everything stopped. The creature hissed and recoiled into the shadows. Amber's eyes shot to the light, her chest heaving with relief. Someone was here. Someone had come for her. But when she turned to face them, the light faded. And the figure who stepped into view wasn't a rescuer. It was Chelsea. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale, almost lifeless. Her smile was twisted, broken. And she said only one thing. "It's too late." Amber's blood ran cold. She stepped back, eyes wide in disbelief. "Chelsea, what happened to you?" Her voice was a whisper, fragile, trembling. Chelsea's grin only deepened unnatural. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes empty, lost. There was no warmth, no familiarity left in her. Amber felt her stomach turn. "Chelsea," she repeated, choking on the name. Chelsea took a slow, deliberate step forward. No, don't come any closer," Amber gasped, panic rising like a tide. But Chelsea didn't stop. She continued to walk, her feet barely touching the ground, a strange, unnatural glide to her movements. The air around them grew colder, the trees seeming to close in tighter with each step Chelsea took. Amber's pulse raced. The creature was gone, for now, but the horror in front of her was far worse. Chelsea's voice came, hollow and distant. "The monster, it's already inside me." Amber's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" she begged, her voice breaking. Chelsea's smile twisted into something grotesque. The same way it will be inside you soon. Amber's legs felt weak. She stumbled back. No, no, I don't believe you, she cried, shaking her head in disbelief. But Chelsea's eyes never left her. They burned with a dark intensity, as if the life in her was slowly being drained away. Amber backed into a tree, her breath shallow, ragged. The whisper returned, soft at first, but building. Asterisk, you can't escape, star dot. Amber looked at Chelsea's outstretched hand. Her fingers twitched, fingers twisted like claws. And then Amber understood. She wasn't just being hunted. She was being changed. Chelsea was a warning, a broken shell. The creature's power was growing inside her. Amber's throat tightened. She didn't want to believe it. But Chelsea's eyes were empty, a hollow stare that spoke of endless suffering. A long, low growl vibrated the air again. Amber turned, her head spinning. From the corner of her eye, the shadow of the creature was moving toward her. But this time, it wasn't alone. More figures stepped from the darkness, towering shadows that crowded the woods. Amber's body trembled, her mind overwhelmed. Chelsea's voice came again, distant and cold. Run, Amber. Run, if you still can. Amber took a step back, but every direction was blocked. By the monsters, by Chelsea, by the thing that was turning her into them. The world around her seemed to spin. Her legs felt like lead. She had nowhere to go. The creatures surrounded her. Amber's heart beat faster. They were closing in. And with one final, chilling whisper, the creatures said in unison, their voices a chorus of nightmares. Asterisk, you are ours, asterisk. Amber's breath hitched, her chest tightening. The monsters stepped closer, their eyes glowing brighter with each step. Her mind raced. What could she do? What was left? She couldn't outrun them. She couldn't hide. She was trapped. A distant memory flashed in her mind. Chelsea laughing carefree. But that person was gone. This thing before her was no longer her best friend. The creature at the front of the pack took another step forward, towering over her. Its presence was suffocating, the air thick with the stench of decay and rot. Amber swallowed hard, forcing herself to look up at its eyes. It was waiting for her to break. But she wouldn't. Something deep inside her snapped. With a burst of adrenaline, Amber lunged to the side, darting between two trees. She heard the creature's growls, their frustration echoing through the night. They were fast, too fast, but Amber's feet didn't stop. She pushed through the darkness, the cold air stinging her face. She could feel them behind her, their footsteps, the growls. Her heart pounded in her ears. She forced herself to think. Where was the light? She had to find it. The path ahead was unclear, but she didn't care. She could barely see, but she ran, her breath ragged, legs aching. Another growl, closer this time. Amber's heart leaped into her throat. The sound of something heavy crashing through the trees. She risked a glance back. The creatures were gaining on her. Their eyes glinted in the dark, menacing. The biggest one, asterisk the monster asterisk, was right behind her. Amber turned sharply, diving into a thicket. She felt something grab her leg, pulling her down. Her scream echoed through the woods. The creature's grip was unrelenting. It yanked her backward, dragging her toward it. Her fingers scrabbled for purchase on the ground, but the earth was slick with wet leaves. She tried to kick, to pull away, but it was too strong. Her chest tightened, panic flooding her veins. And then, through the chaos, she saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering, barely visible. It was small, a beacon. She gathered every last ounce of strength she had. With a cry, Amber broke free from the creature's grasp. She didn't look back. She ran. Each step felt like it might be her last. The light grew brighter. It was closer. She could make it. Amber burst through the trees, finally reaching the clearing, but the moment she stepped into the light, everything stopped. The monsters were gone. The forest was silent again. Amber's breath came in quick bursts. She was trembling, covered in dirt and sweat. But the relief didn't last. The light flickered, dimming as a shadow passed over her. And then, from behind, a voice. The same voice. Soft, cold, and full of darkness. "You can never escape." Amber spun around, heart in her throat. The creature was standing in the shadows, smiling. The world around her began to fade. The darkness swallowed her whole. Amber's pulse raced as she stood frozen in place. Her breath was ragged, each inhale sharp with panic. The creature's grin stretched wider, its teeth glistening in the dim light. Her body trembled, but her mind refused to stop. She couldn't let it win. She couldn't let them win. The creature took a slow step forward, its eyes never leaving hers. Amber's heart hammered in her chest, but something inside her sparked. Fight back. She wasn't sure how, but she had to. With a sudden burst of energy, she turned and bolted toward the edge of the clearing. Her legs screamed in protest, her body burning with exhaustion. But she couldn't stop now. The creatures were still behind her, their growls vibrating the ground beneath her. Amber's vision blurred. Her body felt like it was moving through molasses, but she forced herself to keep going. The light, though dimming, was her only chance. The path ahead was narrow, but she pushed through it, crashing through branches and brush. The sounds of the creatures grew fainter as she ran deeper into the woods, but Amber knew they weren't gone. She could feel them, their presence always lurking just out of sight. The dark trees seemed to close in around her, their shadows twisting and stretching, following her every step. She stumbled, tripping over a root, but caught herself before falling. She had to keep moving. There was no other choice. Suddenly she saw it. A house. A small, worn-down cottage stood at the edge of the woods, its windows dark and still. Amber didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, her legs burning, her breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. Her hands fumbled with the door, her heart pounding in her ears. It opened. She slammed it shut behind her, her back pressed against it as she gasped for air. Her mind spun as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. Was she safe? She didn't know. The silence in the house was deafening. But then a whisper, a voice from the shadows. Amber. She froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. Her body went cold. Amber, it's too late. It's always been too late. Amber's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the voice. A figure stepped from the shadows, slowly, deliberately. It was Chelsea. Her face was hollow, her eyes empty, and her smile, it was twisted. "I tried to warn you." Chelsea's voice was a mere echo, her words distant and cold. Amber's legs felt like lead. She couldn't move. The light in the cottage flickered and died. The shadows closed in, and in that moment Amber understood. She wasn't alone in the house. She never had been. The monsters were already here, that Amber's blood ran cold as the darkness swallowed the room. Chelsea's form seemed to flicker in the dim light, her smile stretching impossibly wide. Amber's heart raced, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs refused to move. The house was eerily silent, too silent. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with something oppressive, suffocating. Chelsea stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Why didn't you listen, Amber?" Chelsea's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a blade. Amber opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The shadows around them twisted, curling in on themselves. Amber's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help her. But there was nothing, only the suffocating darkness and the whisper of Chelsea's voice. Amber, Chelsea's voice came again, softer this time, almost a purr. And then, in a flash, the room exploded with a cold, crushing presence. Amber's breath caught as the creature emerged from the shadows. It was standing behind Chelsea now, its towering form blocking the doorway. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Its long, clawed fingers curled around the edges of the doorway, its breath heavy and deep. Amber's blood ran cold as she realized. This was no longer just about Chelsea. The creature's presence was overwhelming. It filled the room, pushing in on her from all sides. Chelsea turned slowly, her eyes vacant, her smile widening. And in that moment, Amber saw it, the thing that had taken Chelsea from her. The dark presence that was now pulling at her, clawing at her mind. "You've always been mine," Chelsea whispered, her voice no longer her own. Amber felt something cold slither through her veins, a dark, oppressive force that clung to her, wrapping around her like chains. Her vision began to blur, her head spinning. The creature's growl rumbled through the walls, its voice seeping into her very bones. Amber tried to move, to escape, but it was useless. The air grew heavier, suffocating. The creature was no longer just a shadow. It was real, and Amber was trapped. The last thing she saw before everything went black was Chelsea's face, twisted, broken, her eyes glowing with the same emptiness that filled the air. The creature's laugh echoed through the room, and then there was only silence, darkness. Amber had been taken, and the monster had claimed its next victim. The silence was deafening. Amber's mind was foggy, her body heavy. She could barely move, her limbs feeling as though they were bound by invisible chains. The darkness pressed in on her, cold and suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't understand why she couldn't breathe. Where was she? Her eyes slowly opened, blinking against the darkness. Her vision was blurry, as if the world around her was submerged underwater. And then the whispers started, soft at first, like a distant murmur, but they grew louder, clearer. It was the creature's voice, but now it sounded different. It was no longer a growl, no longer a mere whisper in her mind. It was something more insistent. "Amber," it hissed, its voice like ice scraping against her soul. "You were never meant to escape." Amber's chest tightened. The air around her was thick with the scent of decay, the smell of something ancient and wrong. She tried to push herself up, but her body didn't obey. She was paralyzed, locked in place by something unseen. Then, a flicker of movement in the corner of her vision. She turned her head, but it was too dark. She couldn't see anything clearly, but the whispers grew louder, swirling around her, suffocating her thoughts. "Amber, you belong here. We belong together." A cold wind brushed against her skin, and then she felt something, a presence, looming over her. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, the weight of it. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the voice, the suffocating darkness. The ground beneath her shifted, and Amber could feel herself being pulled, dragged deeper into the black void. But then, just as she was sure she would be lost forever, something snapped in her mind. A memory, bright, sharp, clear. Chelsea's laughter, carefree and full of life. And then the fear that something was wrong, that something had changed. Amber's eyes snapped open, her body trembling with fear and desperation. She wasn't alone. She could feel the presence. It was watching her, waiting, but she couldn't give up. She wouldn't give in. With a final burst of strength, she forced her body to move. Her legs felt like lead, but she pushed through the numbness, crawling toward the edge of the darkness. She had to escape. She had to fight. But as she reached out, her hand brushed against something cold, something that shouldn't have been there, something soft. She pulled back, her heart skipping a beat. It was a face, a pale, twisted face, half hidden in the shadows. And then the voice, a familiar voice. Amber, you can't run. You can't hide. You belong here now. Chelsea's smile filled her vision, but it was no longer her. It was the creature. The same dark force that had taken her. The monster had her. It had both of them now. Amber's blood ran cold as she realized. Asterisk, this wasn't just about survival anymore, asterisk. She was already part of it, that Amber's breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just running from the creature anymore. She was becoming it. The twisted face in the darkness smiled, its eyes hollow and cold. Chelsea's face! Asterisk, no, not Chelsea anymore, asterisk, grinned back at her. The once familiar warmth of her friend had been consumed by something darker, something hungry. Amber felt the coldness crawling under her skin, like it was twisting inside her veins, pulling her into a void she couldn't escape. Her heart raced, but there was no way to outrun what was already inside her. The darkness pressed in from every side. Amber, the creature's voice was a low, mocking echo of Chelsea's, but it didn't sound human. It was raw, filled with malice. You were always meant to be here, to join us. Amber's fingers trembled as she gripped the cold ground beneath her. Her skin felt too tight, as if it was about to burst. No, she whispered, but the word tasted hollow in her mouth. It was too late to stop it now. The shadows were already wrapping themselves around her, constricting, pulling her deeper into their grip. The thing inside her, asterisk the monster asterisk, was feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. She could feel it. It was in her now. Her body ached, her limbs heavy and numb, like they were no longer hers to control. The creature stood over her, its grin widening with each passing moment. It was like it was savoring her agony, relishing every flicker of fear and resistance. You'll become one of us, Amber, the voice purred. You'll see the truth soon enough. There's no escape from this. There's no light left for you to reach. Amber's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled against the pressure, but the creature's presence suffocated her, smothering her hope. The walls were closing in, the darkness overwhelming, and she felt herself slipping. She couldn't fight it anymore. Her thoughts were slipping, her mind hazy. But somewhere deep inside, a flicker of something, asterisk a spark of defiance asterisk, remained. No, she whispered again, this time with more force. I won't become you. And for the first time, she managed to push back, just a little. The pressure around her chest loosened, ever so slightly. Her fingers clenched, digging into the earth beneath her. She could feel the tendrils of darkness tightening around her, but something inside her fought back. Something human. She wasn't lost yet. Not completely. With every ounce of willpower she had left, Amber pulled herself up, her legs shaking. Her body screamed in protest, but she pushed through. She could still feel the thing inside her, pulling at her soul, but she refused to let go of what made her her. The darkness roared in fury as Amber took another step forward, her breath ragged. Her surroundings flickered, shifting. The walls of the dark void seemed to bend, stretch, as though the creature was struggling to keep her contained. She wasn't going down without a fight. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, she heard a faint, familiar voice. Asterisk Amber, don't give in asterisk. It was Chelsea's voice. But it wasn't tainted by the creature. Amber's eyes snapped open, wide with fear and realization. The voice was trying to reach her. Her friend, asterisk the real Chelsea asterisk, was still there. Somewhere buried deep inside. Amber closed her eyes for a brief moment, focusing on that whisper of hope. And with a deep, shaky breath, she made a decision. The monster could take her body, but it would never take her mind. Not yet. Not ever. She would fight. Until the very end. Amber turned toward the shadows, the creatures lurking just beyond her reach, and screamed into the darkness. "I will never be yours." The darkness seemed to shudder at Amber's defiance. Her scream echoed through the void, rippling like a wave through the air. For a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. The creatures, the shadows, everything that had once held her captive, paused. Then, as if her cry had triggered something, the presence in the room stirred. A low growl vibrated the ground beneath her. It was the monster, the thing that had consumed Chelsea. It was furious. Amber could feel its anger washing over her like a tidal wave, but it only made her more determined. She was slipping, but she wasn't lost yet. The spark that had once been inside Chelsea was now inside her, buried deep, but still burning. It was her only chance. The creatures snarled, their growls sharp and hateful. The shadows around Amber twisted violently, claws of darkness reaching for her, pulling at her, trying to drag her back into their grasp. Amber's chest tightened, but she stood her ground, forcing herself to take another shaky step forward. "I won't be your puppet," she cried, her voice hoarse, but filled with a strength she didn't know she still had. The darkness pulsed again, swirling around her like an angry storm. It was no use pretending that she wasn't terrified. Her body was trembling, every inch of her aching and exhausted. But she wasn't giving up. She couldn't. As Amber took another step, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and the shadows seemed to recoil, momentarily losing their grip. She pushed harder, moving faster, ignoring the way the darkness clawed at her skin, at her thoughts. It was getting weaker. She could feel it. Someone asterisk, was still reaching for her. That voice. Chelsea. Her voice. It was faint, but it was there. The real Chelsea was still fighting, still alive, inside the darkness. Amber, fight. The voice whispered again, distant but clear. And in that moment, Amber knew what she had to do. She had to break the hold. She didn't know how, but she felt it. Felt the power shifting. The creature in the shadows roared, its growl a deafening roar of frustration. But Amber didn't flinch. Her thoughts sharpened, like a blade slicing through the fog in her mind. The darkness trembled, as though it was losing its grip on her. "No more," Amber whispered, her voice shaking with the force of her resolve. The room seemed to darken even further, but then the faintest light flickered in the distance. A flicker of hope. It was so small, so weak, but it was there. It came from Chelsea, from the part of Chelsea that had been buried deep inside the monster. Amber's hand stretched toward the light, every muscle screaming in protest. But she reached for it with everything she had. One last push. And then, with a sudden burst of energy, the creature roared again. But this time, Amber didn't back down. Her fingers brushed the light, and the air around her exploded in a flash of blinding brightness. A sharp, guttural scream tore through the space, and the darkness writhed, screeching in pain. Amber felt it, the grip loosening, the weight lifting, and then, just as quickly, the light surged. The creatures shrieked and scattered, their forms breaking apart in the blinding glow. The darkness receded, and Chelsea's voice, soft and broken, whispered one final time, Amber, it's over. You're free, Amber blinked, dazed and trembling, as the last remnants of shadow melted away into the light. The air was still. The forest was silent. She was standing in the clearing again, the sun's weak rays filtering through the trees. And Chelsea, the real Chelsea was there, standing in front of her, her face filled with sorrow and relief. "Amber," Chelsea whispered, her voice cracking. "You saved me." But Amber's heart was heavy. She had won. Yes. But at what cost? The monster might be gone, but its darkness, it would always be a part of her. Amber stood in the clearing, her body still trembling, the weight of the moment settling over her like a thick fog. The forest around them was still, the air eerily calm after the chaos. Chelsea's face was soft with relief, but Amber couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Amber," Chelsea's voice trembled, and she reached out, her hand hovering uncertainly before dropping back to her side. "You did it. You freed us. You freed me." Amber didn't know how to respond. The words felt hollow in her mouth. She had saved Chelsea, yes, but at what cost? She looked around, her eyes darting nervously from the trees to the ground, as if expecting the darkness to leap back out at her from the shadows. But everything was still. Everything was silent, except for the thudding of her own heart. "Are we really free?" Amber whispered, more to herself than to Chelsea. Her voice was shaky, uncertain. Chelsea smiled weakly, stepping closer. "Yes, Amber, we are. It's over. The monster, it can't touch us anymore." But Amber could still feel the tendrils of the darkness wrapped around her soul. She could feel them whispering, faint but constant. "You belong to us." The thought made her shudder. No, she refused to listen. She wouldn't be taken again. Not by the shadows, not by the monster, and not even by the memory of what she'd just gone through. But the lingering fear in the back of her mind wouldn't let go. She could feel the monster's presence, almost as if it was still lurking in the depths of her mind, waiting for the right moment to strike again. "Amber," Chelsea's voice broke through her thoughts. Amber blinked and looked up to see Chelsea's face, full of concern. "You don't look like you're okay," Chelsea said, her eyes searching Amber's face. "I don't blame you, but you're safe now. We're safe." Amber opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She just stared at her friend, still unsure. Chelsea's face, her real face, was here, in front of her. But it was hard to trust it. Hard to trust that everything was truly over. "I don't know," Amber finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if it's over. I don't know if I can ever be free of it." Chelsea stepped forward, her hand reaching out again, this time gently touching Amber's arm. "I'm here, Amber," she said softly. "We both are. The monster is gone. You're not alone." But the words didn't bring the comfort they once might have. The forest felt too quiet, and somewhere deep inside her, Amber knew. She knew it wasn't really over. The fight had just changed. She might have escaped the monster, but the darkness was a part of her now, etched into her very soul. The flicker of light that had saved them. It had been Chelsea, but there was more to it. The light was also Amber's strength, her defiance. And the monster, it wasn't just an external force. It had been within her, too. Her body shook again, and she pulled away from Chelsea's touch, her eyes wide and panicked. "I can feel it," Amber whispered. "I can feel it in my head. It's still here." Chelsea's expression shifted. The softness in her eyes turned to something more uncertain, more distant. "What do you mean?" Amber's hands trembled as she gripped the sides of her head, the memories of the darkness swirling inside her. Too loud, too suffocating. The creature's voice, its whisper, "You belong to us." "It's still inside me," Amber muttered, her voice cracking. She could feel it, a part of the darkness, lingering beneath the surface. Waiting. Chelsea stepped back, eyes wide with shock. "Amber, you're not. Her words faltered, unsure of how to respond. Amber shook her head quickly, trying to push the overwhelming sensation away, but it was no use. The monster had left her physically, but its essence had rooted itself too deep. It had left its mark, and that mark would never fade. Amber's breath quickened as she realized the truth. She wasn't free. Not completely. The monster had left her body, yes, but the darkness had become a part of her, woven into her very being. It would never let go, and neither would she. She looked at Chelsea, her voice barely above a whisper. You need to go." It's not safe here. Not for you. Chelsea frowned, confused. Amber, what are you talking about? Amber took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she backed away. I can feel it, Chelsea. The monster might be gone, but it's still here. And I'm not sure how much longer I can keep it inside. Tears stung her eyes as she turned away, taking a step toward the dark forest behind her. I have to find a way to end this. For both of us. For everyone. The fear in Chelsea's voice was unmistakable as she called out to her. Amber, don't. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to fight it by yourself. But Amber couldn't listen. She didn't have a choice anymore. The darkness was with her, a constant shadow, and she wasn't sure if it was hers to control or if it would eventually consume her completely. As Amber turned into the woods, the shadows whispered once again, but this time she didn't flinch. It was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Amber moved deeper into the woods, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. The trees loomed around her, twisted and dark, as though the forest itself was alive, watching, waiting. The whispering shadows clung to her, curling around her mind like smoke. Asterisk, you belong to us. You belong to us, asterisk. Her hands shook as she pushed through the underbrush, each step taking her further away from Chelsea, from everything she knew. But she couldn't let anyone else get pulled into this darkness. Not now. Not when she could still feel it gnawing at her soul. The monster had left its mark on her, its cold, insidious touch. And no matter how much she wanted to escape it, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting, lurking in the corners of her mind, ready to swallow her whole. The wind whispered through the trees, eerie and cold, as though the forest itself had been touched by the darkness. Amber could feel her breath quickening as the shadows seemed to gather, pressing closer, wrapping around her. Fight it, she told herself, forcing her legs to move, ignoring the growing weight in her chest. The darkness could not win. She wouldn't let it, but the forest seemed endless. The deeper she went, the darker it became. The trees twisted at odd angles, their gnarled branches reaching toward her like skeletal hands. It was then she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. Amber. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat, her body tensing at the sound. It wasn't Chelsea's voice this time. It was deeper, rougher, darker. Asterisk, Amber, you can't escape us. You never will, asterisk. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, swirling around her, making her head spin. Amber's stomach churned with panic. She clutched her chest, struggling to breathe, but she couldn't let it get to her. She couldn't. With shaking hands, she grabbed the nearest tree for support, pressing her forehead against the rough bark. No, she gasped, her voice cracking. I won't let you control me. The ground beneath her trembled, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Asterisk, you're already ours. You always have been, asterisk. Amber's pulse raced. The shadows were closing in, surrounding her on all sides. She could feel their icy presence creeping up her spine, seeping into her thoughts, twisting her will. The urge to give in, just for a moment, was strong. It would be so easy to let go, to let the darkness take her fully. But that was what it wanted. That was exactly what it had been waiting for. Amber clenched her fists, her nails digging into the bark of the tree. No, she would not let it take her. Asterisk, I am not yours. Asterisk, she screamed, her voice raw and desperate, the words echoing through the woods. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers ceased, and the shadows pulled back, as though taken aback by her defiance. But then they returned, more insistent, more forceful than before. Asterisk, you cannot fight forever. You cannot run from us. You're ours, Amber. We will never let you go, asterisk. The air grew colder, the ground beneath her feet shifting as though the earth itself was moving. Amber stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had to keep going. She had to find a way out of this nightmare. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A flicker of light. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. A glimmer of warmth in the cold, a sliver of hope in the dark. It wasn't the darkness. It wasn't the monster. It was Chelsea. Chelsea, Amber thought, feeling the pulse of that light deep inside her. Chelsea had been a part of her strength, and her fight wasn't over yet. Amber wasn't alone. She couldn't afford to let the darkness win. With a final burst of energy, Amber turned toward the light, pushing through the haze of shadows that threatened to engulf her. Each step was harder than the last, her legs heavy, her mind clouded. But she had to reach the light. It was her only chance. And then, suddenly, she felt it, like a hand wrapping around her, pulling her forward. Not alone. The light enveloped her, warm and steady. It was Chelsea, or at least part of Chelsea, the part of her that had fought alongside Amber, that had kept her tethered to the world. Amber, Chelsea's voice came again, clear and real, though it was soft, like a whisper on the wind. Asterisk, you're not alone. We're together, asterisk. Amber's heart swelled with relief. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. With the last of her strength, Amber reached out and grasped the light. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the darkness began to fade. But Amber knew the fight was far from over. The light was still fragile, and the monster's whispers were still with her, lingering in the shadows. But she wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The journey had just begun that Amber's fingers tightened around the light, a faint warmth seeping through her cold, trembling hands. It was Chelsea, asterisk part asterisk of Chelsea, still with her. But the shadows weren't giving up. The darkness roared, a guttural growl that rattled her bones. It surged forward, threatening to swallow her whole. The forest around her seemed to distort, the trees bending, their branches twisting like claws reaching for her, trying to pull her back into the depths of the nightmare. But Amber held on. With every breath, the light inside her grew stronger, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Chelsea's voice echoed in her mind, soft and soothing, like a beacon through the storm. "You're not alone, Amber," Chelsea whispered again, the sound of it almost like a lifeline. "I'm here. We're here." Amber closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. The darkness was closing in, but so was the light. It was a battle, one she had to fight with everything she had left. And then she remembered. The truth wasn't just about escaping the monster. It was about confronting it. Confronting the darkness within her. The darkness that had been there all along, feeding on her fear, her doubt, her anger. It had tried to consume her, tried to twist her into something she wasn't. But now, Amber realized something. Asterisk, she didn't have to fight it alone, star. She wasn't just battling the shadows around her. She was fighting the parts of herself that had allowed them in. With a deep, steadying breath, Amber opened her eyes. The light she held in her hands flared brighter, a sharp contrast against the dark. "Asterisk, I'm not you, asterisk," she said, her voice a trembling whisper at first, but gaining strength. "Asterisk, I am not yours, asterisk." The darkness hesitated for the briefest moment. Then it lunged. But this time, Amber was ready. She felt the light inside her surge, burning with a fierce intensity. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in pain, their forms shifting and twisting in the light's glow. Amber's heart raced, but she pressed on, reaching deeper into herself for the strength that had been buried there all along. The light wasn't just Chelsea's. It was hers, too. The strength, the hope, the defiance. It had always been inside her. She just had to believe in it. With one final, determined shout, Amber thrust the light forward. The darkness screamed, a high-pitched wail that made her ears ring. For a moment, it felt like the world was crashing down around her. The ground beneath her feet trembled violently. But then, the shrieks faded. The shadows began to melt away, their forms dissolving into the air, leaving nothing but the faintest traces of smoke in their wake. And then there was silence. Amber stood, breathing heavily, her body shaking with exhaustion. She felt the weight of the battle pressing down on her, but she didn't dare let herself collapse. She had won. For now, the light inside her slowly dimmed, but it remained. A quiet, steady pulse, like a heartbeat. It wasn't over yet, not completely, but the worst of it had passed. Amber turned, her eyes scanning the forest around her. It was still. The trees stood tall and silent, their gnarled branches no longer reaching out to pull her in. The air was clear, free of the suffocating darkness that had once consumed everything. And then she heard it. Amber. It was Chelsea's voice again, softer now, but still there. Amber spun around, her heart skipping a beat. But this time, the fear didn't grip her. This time, she felt something else. Something she hadn't felt in what felt like forever. Hope. Chelsea was there, standing just beyond the light's reach, her face soft and tired, but no longer clouded with the darkness that had once taken over her. "We made it," Amber whispered, her voice hoarse, but full of relief. Chelsea nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. We made it. Amber took a tentative step toward her, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on her chest. You're really here, Chelsea smiled weakly. "I never left, Amber. I just needed you to remember." Amber nodded, feeling the last of the shadows fade from her mind. The battle had been fierce, but it wasn't over. Not yet. There would be more to face, more darkness to confront. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Amber felt like she had the strength to face it. They weren't alone, and together they would survive. Amber took Chelsea's hand, feeling the warmth of it, the promise of solidarity, and together they walked forward into the uncertain path ahead. One step at a time, the air around them was still, but there was an unfamiliar lightness now. The oppressive weight of the shadows had lifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Amber could breathe. The forest around them, once a maze of twisting trees and creeping shadows, now felt open, free. The distant sound of birds chirping in the trees seemed almost surreal in comparison to the nightmare that had just passed. But Amber knew better than to believe it was truly over. The darkness hadn't just vanished, it had faded, and Amber could still feel its ghost lingering, like a faint echo in the back of her mind. She wasn't sure if it would return, or if it would find new ways to pull her back into the abyss. But right now, she had the one thing that had always been the key to her survival: hope, and that, for now, was enough. "You're different," Chelsea said softly, her eyes searching Amber's face. There was something new in the way she looked at her. Respect, gratitude, maybe even a little fear. Amber swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. "I feel different." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I think I've always been different." Chelsea nodded slowly, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. "Maybe, but you survived it, Amber. You conquered it." Amber's heart beat faster at those words. She wasn't sure she'd ever feel entirely free from the darkness inside her, but there was something freeing about Chelsea's belief in her, about the fact that they had fought this battle together. "I don't know if I'm ready to go back," Amber admitted, her voice tight, with the fear that still clung to her like a second skin. Chelsea studied her for a moment, her face softening. "It's okay. We don't have to go back yet. We're not running anymore." Amber closed her eyes, letting the warmth of Chelsea's words settle over her like a blanket. She was right. They were no longer running. For the first time, Amber felt like she could face whatever was to come, not alone, but with someone by her side. "Do you think it's over?" Amber asked after a long pause, her voice quiet, uncertain. Chelsea didn't answer immediately, but instead stepped closer to Amber, her expression thoughtful. I think the darkness, it's always going to be there. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe it won't control us anymore. But it'll always be a part of us. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Amber's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't from fear or grief. They were from something softer, something she hadn't felt in so long. Acceptance. She realized with a rush of clarity that Chelsea was right. The darkness had been a part of her. It had shaped her, scarred her, but it also hadn't broken her. She hadn't broken, not yet. And as long as they had each other, Amber felt like she could face whatever came next. "I'm not afraid of it anymore," Amber whispered, her voice full of quiet strength. Chelsea's eyes softened, and she reached out to squeeze Amber's hand, as if to affirm that Amber wasn't alone in this battle. "Neither am I." They stood there in the stillness of the forest, letting the cool breeze wash over them. The sun had begun to sink lower in the sky, painting the world in shades of purple and orange. Amber took a deep breath, feeling the weight in her chest ease for the first time in what felt like years. The journey was far from over, and the darkness still lingered in the corners of her mind, but as long as she had hope, she would continue to fight. They would continue to fight, together. The last remnants of the shadows seemed to dissolve completely, leaving behind a peaceful quiet. But Amber knew that peace wasn't permanent. She had learned that much. As the night began to settle in, the forest around them felt like a new beginning, a new chapter. And for the first time in a long time, Amber allowed herself to believe in a future where the darkness didn't control her, where she wasn't a victim, where she was in control. And wherever the road would lead next, she would walk it, with Chelsea. And with the light that had never really left her, the stars began to twinkle above them, distant and cold. But Amber found herself watching them with a sense of calm. The night was settling in, and with it, a stillness that felt almost comforting, an emptiness that didn't feel like loss, but rather like a promise of something new. Still, there was something in the air that made her uneasy. The forest was calm, yes, but the silence felt too loud, as if the world was holding its breath. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting. It was the same feeling she'd had when they first ventured into the woods, that prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling that danger was still lurking, just out of sight. "Amber," Chelsea said quietly, her voice breaking through Amber's thoughts. She turned to face her, her expression uncertain. "Do you think it's really over?" Amber didn't answer immediately. Her mind was spinning, her heart pounding in her chest as she fought the lingering dread that clung to her. The truth was, she didn't know. She wanted to believe it was over, that the nightmare was finally finished, but the shadows had been inside her for so long. They hadn't just tried to break her, they had tried to claim her. And that kind of darkness didn't vanish overnight. "I don't know," Amber said, her voice strained. "It doesn't feel over, does it? Like it's still waiting." Chelsea stepped closer, her hand brushing Amber's arm in an unspoken gesture of solidarity. "We're still standing, Amber. That counts for something. We've come this far, right? Together." Amber looked at her, feeling a surge of warmth in her chest. Chelsea was right. They had made it this far. They had faced the worst of it and survived. And yet, Amber couldn't ignore the part of her that was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the darkness to rise again. The wind rustled through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. There it was again, the sense that something was lurking just beyond the edges of the light. "I think we should keep moving," Amber said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. "We can't stay here. Not yet." Chelsea hesitated, her eyes darting around, as if sensing the same unease. "You think we're still in danger?" Amber nodded, her expression serious. "Maybe not immediately, but it's like the forest itself is waiting. Like the darkness isn't gone, just hidden. Chelsea glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting to see something creeping out of the shadows. Amber could see the fear in her friend's eyes, the fear that they might not be safe, even after everything they had been through. "You think the monster, it could come back?" Chelsea asked softly, her voice trembling with the possibility. "I don't know," Amber replied, her throat tightening, "but I can still feel it, in the back of my mind, whispering, 'I'm afraid it's not over.'" "Not really." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their words hanging between them like a heavy fog. Amber knew they couldn't stay here, not in this limbo, this strange place between the past and the unknown future. The journey had to continue. They couldn't stop now. "Come on," Amber said, pulling herself together, shaking off the lingering dread. "We'll keep moving. We'll find a place to rest, figure out what's next." Chelsea nodded, her expression still unsure but resolute. Together, they began walking, the ground beneath their feet soft, with fallen leaves. The trees around them seemed to close in, casting long shadows that flickered in the corner of Amber's vision. They didn't speak for a while. The silence felt heavy, as though the woods were watching them, waiting for something. Finally, Chelsea spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Amber, do you think we'll ever find peace?" Amber didn't have an answer. The question hung in the air unanswered, because she didn't know. She didn't know if peace was something they could ever truly have again. But she knew one thing for sure. They would keep moving forward. They would keep fighting. Because as long as they had each other, Amber knew they could face whatever came next. And just as she was about to say something, anything, to reassure Chelsea, the wind shifted again, colder now. A low growl echoed through the trees, distant but unmistakable. Amber froze, her blood running cold. The shadows moved. Not far away, something was watching them. The monster wasn't done yet. And this time, it was waiting in the dark. The growl sent a cold chill down Amber's spine, her heart thundering in her chest as the sound of it reverberated through the trees. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't just the night. It was the monster. For a moment, time stood still. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the faint rustle of leaves the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. Amber's pulse hammered in her ears as she turned toward Chelsea, who had frozen beside her, eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" Chelsea whispered, her voice trembling. "It's here." Amber nodded, her throat dry. The darkness was back, but it was different this time. The air felt thick, like the very forest was alive with its presence, watching them, waiting. It was no longer just an entity lurking in the shadows. It had become something more. It had become a part of the night itself, an unrelenting force that wouldn't let them go. "I don't think we can outrun it anymore," Amber said, her voice steady despite the fear tightening around her chest. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Amber could feel the weight of the darkness closing in. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside her, too, a part of her, feeding on her every thought, every doubt. She had thought they were safe, thought they had conquered it. But the truth was, the monster was more than just a creature. It was fear, and it had been inside them both all along. "Amber," Chelsea said quietly, her voice breaking through Amber's spiraling thoughts. "I'm scared. What if we can't stop it this time?" Amber swallowed hard, the terror rising in her throat. But there was something else there, too, a strength that had been born from the darkness, a resilience that she hadn't known she had until now. "We can't stop it by running," Amber said firmly, "but we can fight. Together." Chelsea's eyes met hers, wide with fear, but also with a flicker of determination. "Together," she repeated. And in that moment, Amber realized that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about defiance. It was about choosing to stand, even when the world felt like it was crumbling around them. The growl grew louder, closer. But Amber didn't flinch. "Let's finish this," she whispered, the words a promise as much as a challenge. And as the darkness closed in, Amber and Chelsea stood together, ready to face the final battle. The monster wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The growl that had once filled the forest now seemed to hang in the air, no longer a distant threat, but an undeniable presence. Amber felt it in her chest, a deep, vibrating hum that echoed in the very marrow of her bones. The darkness was here, and it had come to claim them both. But Amber no longer felt the same fear she had when they first encountered the monster. Something had changed within her, something that hadn't been there before. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore, not just because Chelsea was beside her, but because she had changed. She had faced the deepest parts of herself, and in doing so, had uncovered a strength she never knew she possessed. The forest was eerily silent, but the stillness felt different this time. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't suffocating. It was a moment of clarity, of quiet before the storm. Amber took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, and she turned to Chelsea. "We're ready," Amber whispered, her voice low but steady. Chelsea's eyes met hers, filled with the same determination, the same quiet strength. Together, Amber felt her pulse quicken, not out of fear, but anticipation. The monster had been a part of them, a manifestation of their deepest fears, their darkest moments. But now, Amber understood something she hadn't before. The monster was not invincible. It was only as powerful as the fear it fed on, and Amber was done running from it. With a fierce resolve, Amber stepped forward, feeling the light within her grow once again. She could hear the monster moving in the darkness around them, the sound of its growls growing louder. But she didn't flinch. She held her ground, her heartbeat steady in her chest. And then she felt it, the surge of energy from deep within, that place she had locked away for so long. The darkness around them seemed to recoil at the light she radiated. It was nothing magical, nothing supernatural. It was simply the force of will, the refusal to be consumed by fear any longer. "This ends now, Amber said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong. And as the words left her lips, the shadows began to pull back, as if they themselves were afraid. The night fell silent once more. The monster's presence began to wane, dissipating like smoke in the wind, leaving only the faintest trace behind. Amber and Chelsea stood there, still and unwavering, the weight of the battle fading away like a bad dream. They had faced the darkness, not just outside, but within themselves, and they had won. Chelsea reached for Amber's hand, her fingers trembling, but her grip strong. "We did it," she said softly. Amber nodded, feeling the exhaustion settle over her, but a quiet peace as well. "We did." The air was clearer now. The forest no longer felt threatening, the shadows no longer a menace. They had crossed through the storm and come out on the other side, changed but stronger. There was still a long road ahead. Amber knew the fight was never truly over. There would always be more shadows to face, more battles to fight. But in this moment, in the soft light of dawn breaking through the trees, Amber felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. And that was enough. Together, they walked away, hand in hand, into the world that awaited them. A world that felt, for the first time in a long time, full of possibilities. The darkness had lost its grip, and they were free.